Guy Giffin is associate of the Major Projects Association. He's a philosophy graduate from the University of Bristol in 1990. And he's also an associate at the National School of Government and has worked with several UK government departments, including DCMS, MOD, National Audit Office, and NHS. He's delivered hundreds, if not thousands, of simulation workshops around the world with organisations you and I will both have heard of. From A to U, I think. What's the matter? Zenica weren't interested? But let me hand over to Guy, because it's his story you want to hear and not mine.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Yeah, so I suppose I was hoping to share about 15 or 16 years now of working under this heading of learning technologies. We were born out of a business school in France, INSEAD, where we helped found the Centre for Advanced Learning Technologies. So this conference I've been suggesting to Don, who organises it, for a few years that I might be able to share some thoughts on this topic, and he finally relented this year. But yeah, I was going to hopefully share an unusual perspective, I think, on how we've used technology to develop a certain type of skill and a type of knowledge. We use words like knowledge and learning fairly freely in these sorts of contexts, but I'm going to expand on this particular point immediately, really, about what are we talking about here, what sorts of knowledge are we talking about. And the distinction, by the way, that we normally make is between tacit and explicit, and I'll explain in a second with an indication of, and also a quick quiz in a second with a cash prize as well to keep you interested. But I was going to also reassure you that, as Phil briefly alluded to, we've been doing this for a while. We've been doing it with certainly some of Europe's leading business educators. We work with all of the business schools shown there, and also quite a few organisations that some of you may work with. Plus many more, really. We're an Anglo-French company, so we've done quite a bit of stuff with some French-based organisations as well. But the tools on our work in this area, I suppose, has constantly evolved from the input and the expertise of very much our client organisations as well. And so I was just trying to sort of reassure you that this is not a couple of sort of academics in an ivory tower. The tools in our work in this area is very much sort of informed and developed by sort of real practitioners. And if anything, it's sort of aimed, I suppose, at sort of middle, senior managers in particular, those sorts of skill areas, project managers, particularly in organisations like Jonathan's, actually, where we do, in fact, a bit of work. But the distinction between tacit and explicit knowledge is really what I'm trying to do initially. And the driving test, the process you have to go through in order to be allowed to be, to drive on the road, certainly in this country, involves two, in some sense, distinct tests. And this is actually a section from essentially a part of the theory test or a practice exercise on this. And that is what I would describe very much as explicit. And the question actually is posed there is, which of these signs shows that you're entering a one-way system? Anyone just shout out, if we call them A, B, C, D, moving from top to left to bottom, which one do you think is the answer, by the way? Do you want to just all count? Okay, very good. Not too difficult, but also what we're saying is that this type of knowledge is quite easy to sort of transfer, to convey in a simple sort of e-learning, in some sense, traditional e-learning exercise. But would you agree that the majority of what it involves actually to be a good driver, and we all tend to think we are good drivers, would you agree that it's actually more tacit? And the other part of the driving test involves you actually sitting in a car with a brave test instructor and so on, and actually driving a car. And it's certainly that element that we're pointing to in terms of where learning tools are going to be useful. The distinction certainly between explicit and tacit. And to ask you, just in your roles as managers, as in your roles in your organisations, what percentage would you say of what you do you could easily describe and tell somebody how to do it, i.e. explicit? What percentage would you actually find it difficult to share and tell somebody how you do your job, for example? What would you say? Anybody want to throw out? And you perhaps have to think about this, for a while to really come up with a well thought through sort of answer to this question. but I'm simply asking you, what do you reckon? What percentage of your role, anybody want to throw out a percentage of what is, let's say tacit? Anybody want to throw out, how much of your role is a tacit sort of knowledge, a tacit skill? 30, was that? 30% tacit. Any others, just literally some other comments on that? Anybody want to offer a percentage? Maybe we need to clarify this question still a bit further about tacit versus explicit. Should we have a quiz? Yes. So yes, Guy? Yes. Okay, because we could describe this sometimes, and again, words, I'm always a little bit wary of using words to describe these terms, but we have no other instruments for really conveying meaning, but know what and know how is another way of putting this. We'll have a warm-up question perhaps in terms of, for example, what is the speed of sound? And we're talking about in air at room temperature. In meters a second, I think that's pretty close actually. I actually have only got the answer in my head in miles per hour, but anybody want to throw out about 700? Yeah. But actually no one knows that necessarily off the top of their head, the speed of sound, as said, through air at room temperature. It's about 4 times quicker through water apparently. Okay, but that was a warm-up question. Now the cash prize question, part of which I can actually just throw you this tennis ball with it's actually got a €20 note attached to it, and we'll have to just judge whoever answers this question first. Partly this sound travels slightly faster. Sorry, the people sitting at the front have a slight advantage. But the question is now actually on an unrelated topic, but actually connected to the fact that we're a European company and the prize is in euros. Does anybody know the currency of Brazil? Can we shout? Sorry, can someone shout it? The real. Okay, it is the real. Now, the second part of this process is you have to try and catch or ask something next to you to catch this. Okay? You ready to catch? Oh! Bad throw. And the point I'm trying to make here is that, and if you could throw the tennis ball back to me, in fact, yeah. Ooh, via the wire. You didn't take the money. Back again. The point I'm trying to make is that you've taken the money now. Good. In fact, and anybody that saw Ray Kurzweil yesterday, he actually referred to the skill involved in just catching a ball, the quadratic equations he referred to that our brain has to make. But the question now for a larger cash prize would be, how do you throw a tennis ball to me? Anybody answer that? You see what I mean? It's very difficult to describe. So you could sort of say, you have to pull back your arm and move it forward at a certain speed, at a certain angle, but even that would be very difficult to describe exactly what force you're sort of exerting off in throwing a tennis ball. And there...
So through a series of learned behaviours.
Through a series of learnt behaviours.
Yes, because you develop a skill by practice, and you judge, it's to do with judgement, distance, and coordination.
Exactly.
A series of learned behaviours as opposed to one fact.
But in terms of trying to actually convey to somebody, let's say an alien or somebody who'd never seen anybody throw anything before, it would be very difficult to write down how to do that, wouldn't it? They have to just practice effectively. And that's what we're saying in terms of the tacit skills that managers, and particularly the more, I suppose, or the less technical your role becomes, the more that your life becomes about tacit skill. A word, and I guess, about simulations here, using a picture of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, actually, a week before they set off for the moon. Fairly nervous at this point, you would expect them to be, and it made sense to replicate how the lunar module would behave as best they could. It was actually not particularly faithful to how it really behaved in the end. But the concepts behind the simulation and why simulate, I will cover pretty quickly. This is a very basic principle of learning, as you just alluded to really here. Certain things we can only really develop by practicing, by doing them, and by, in the next point really, ideally, understanding the experience we've been through. We sometimes contrast. You stick your hand in a fire, you get very immediate and clear feedback on that experience, and you learn fairly efficiently. But most of what we do, certainly in a business context, cause and effect can be fairly far apart, and we don't always see what we're actually doing. So the idea of a simulation is to give people a a transparent but also risk-free experience. The next generation of learners, and certainly working with business schools, they're struggling with this notion of it no longer being a wise person standing on a stage preaching their expertise. The next generation of learners, we reckon, will increasingly expect more sophisticated learning tools. And games, if we want to call them that, serious games, the concept goes through various fashions of what we call them, but we're talking about sophisticated simulations, some sophisticated games for some challenging areas to develop. We've got the technology now to do some pretty clever stuff with games, but in some sense, most of the investments that have been made in e-learning hasn't really used the technology in terms of its sort of underlying power. It's more the sort of availability of reading materials and so on that has taken the majority of the investment. A quote from Herbert Simon: "A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention." Herbert, who's one of the world's gurus on how human beings make decisions, he said that in 1971. He's no longer with us, Herbert, but I'm sure he'd fall off his chair if he realised how much information is at people's fingertips in 2012. And that hopefully illustrates a little bit better this point we're making. A quote I sometimes use, I wonder if anybody's come across this, but I'm asking you to fill out the last 4 words here effectively. Experience is something you get. Anybody know this one? Anybody come across it? After you need it. And again, this really point about learning from experience is perhaps what most of you would agree. Most of the things probably the most powerful learning experiences you've had, or learning situations you've had, would have come from perhaps difficult experiences. We tend to use the phrase, things like learning the hard way. Okay. I was going to talk very quickly about an industry that takes its learning very seriously. That was born, I guess, potentially with and this is meant to be one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century. Anybody recognise who and what might be in that photograph? Yeah, the Wright brothers. Taken at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, 109 years ago, I guess now, or 108 years and a bit. In fact, it's Orville lying, you can see prostrate on the. They hadn't actually built a cockpit or any sort of cabin at that point. But I'm going to talk very quickly about an industry that takes its learning pretty seriously. The earliest flight simulators, what they found when they designed airplanes in the early part of the 20th century is that they didn't have many experienced pilots, as you would expect. And the accident rate amongst the earliest planes was extremely high. And they actually decided that there were certain aspects that they could simulate at this point without much use of technology. And this was this fairly, in some sense, challenging element of trying to control a plane both sort of laterally and vertically at the same time, which was at the root of many of the obviously fatal accidents that happened very early on. The evolution of the simulator is what I'm just going to show you very briefly here for a couple of minutes. That was in 1910. My father actually was a Navy pilot, and he trained in one of these. He's in his late 70s now, but these have been around since 1934. Ed Link designed this thing because the U.S. Postal Service was using planes increasingly, and again they had very high accident rates, and the casualties associated with that were expensive, and so they decided to invest in a learning tool. But the first sort of 15 years or so of the Link trainer's existence, the developers couldn't work out whether it was just what they described as a novel amusement device, but it had fairly serious sort of learning purposes as well. If we look at the accident rate, you'll be pleased to see that now, I think the implication of this graph is that we need to travel 4 billion miles for it to be likely that they're going to be involved in a fatal plane crash. And we compare this sort of success rate, effectively, of modern civil aviation, for example, with, for example, project management success rates. and we're down to 0.05 sort of reflection of how safe air travel is, and part of that is because of the very effective and very powerful learning tools that the industry uses. This is a shot of one of the most sophisticated flight simulators in the world, a full flight simulator for the A380. It's called a full flight simulator, a level D, 0 flight time, which means that the pilots that can fly this can actually fly it for the first time with passengers without ever having flown a real one. The sophistication of the simulator is actually better than learning on a real plane, because you can do lots of stuff that you can't. But the pilots tend not to tell you that if it happens to be the first time they're flying it. But the simulators are that sophisticated. The trouble is, and to just buy one, this obviously doesn't take into consideration the considerable R&D cost of developing flight simulators. But just to buy one for yourself, effectively, they cost $37 or $50 million or so. But they're pretty serious about their learning. And I suppose what we're trying to sort of examine is why an industry like that, that's very serious about its learning, why doesn't that necessarily get translated to other industries? And I suppose my bias has been towards major projects. And I'm going to tell you a very quick sort of story about something we developed with the Major Projects Association. Because things like High Speed 2, we read about national programs for IT. Lives aren't necessarily at stake, although certainly in a construction project, safety is a pretty critical issue. But lots of money is at stake, and yet the learning tools in spaces like that are virtually non-existent. We don't have anything even sort of even beginning to compare with the sophistication of this sort of learning tool. My personal view on again, sort of e-learning tools for the tacit skills have been largely inappropriate and ineffective, and better described as e-reading in most cases. Okay, but that's a slightly sort of blunt criticism of many of the tools that are out there. The point about developing learning tools for a skill area where there's all sorts of subtle judgments to be made, if you're just producing content, if you're just producing stuff for people to read, whether it's to read or listen or increasingly, I suppose, to sort of watch videos of, it really just doesn't work. It doesn't develop skills beyond a very sort of superficial level. And I use a quote from a famous systems thinker, Russell Ackoff. When you're thinking about developing your learning tools, this quote I think very much applies. It's much better to do the right thing wrong than the wrong thing right. So the suggestion always is try and develop games, try and develop sort of things that replicate the sorts of challenges, and Jonathan's example even then of a sort of, in some way, a dilemma in a sustainability sort of context is a good example of that. But we can take that concept even further, surely, in terms of really sort of replicating the sorts of challenges that your people face. If we think, and this was just to partly sort of compare some of the development of the learning tools with some other sort of, and again, Ray Kurzweil yesterday talked about the really quite astonishing sort of progress in certain aspects of technical development. When I was at university not that long ago, about 25 years ago, this was the type of phone I was using even in my last year at university in 1990. In 23 years, 22 years, that's happened. And that's pretty spectacular, I think you would agree. Similarly, in the game industry, in the pubs I frequented 23 or so years ago, that's what the games tended to look like, or certainly your home computer games. Again, 20 years later, Forza Motorsport. This is a clip, that's just a screenshot from a computer game. The games industry has, arguably the consumer games industry, has certainly taken on board very clearly the advances in technology and the things that's allowing us to do. But still, certainly in the sort of management and general sort of business education space, very little has been done. The particular case that I was going to talk you through briefly was something we developed for the Major Projects Association. And just to give you a very quick sort of overview of that organisation, it's essentially a club of 80 or so organisations, including Balfour Beatty, although I'd had no connection with Jonathan actually before this conference. But organisations involved in major projects, as mentioned, High Speed 2, Crossrail, Channel Tunnel rail links, all those sorts of projects, but also major IT projects, anything sort of big and difficult really that the press tend to seize on. And we asked over a very long sort of, I suppose, survey of what goes on in big projects. We asked a bunch of experts, well, if we're going to build a learning tool about this topic, what sort of messages? What are the objectives? What are we trying to get across here? And I'm just going to list some of the comments that we had from some very experienced people who really have, people who are involved in running the Olympic Games, for example. These were some of the comments they made. Leading a big project, they said, is about judging a series of dilemmas. Okay? The importance of the front end, the start of a project is where they go wrong. Don't just accept the brief. Be realistic. Beware of optimism bias. Maybe some of you have heard of that concept, but human beings tend to be optimistic, especially when it comes to big projects. Risk management, all about mindset. The objectives must be clear. You need to align the stakeholders. Do you see my point here about these were things that, well, we could just put up a list of points like this and say to people, this is what you need to do, but the learning tool was all about trying to bring these sorts of tacit, I would say, comments and expertise to life that actually started to mean something and that would engage the participants other than just us telling them this. Because the point really was that them discovering it was always going to be more powerful than just telling them. And so we developed a simulation for the Major Projects Association, and with them very much, that tries to bring to life those sorts of key challenges, key sort of dynamics and characteristics of big projects. And that involved modeling something in quite a sophisticated way that gives people a pretty good, even if very compressed, experience of what it takes to run a big project. We're modeling, by the way, these are some screenshots just from the simulation, just to give you some idea of this, but we're modeling the technical dimension of a big project. We're also modeling the financial implications. There's a very, in some sense, rich model underneath the simulation about the implications for the future business of the projects related to, and then we're very much simulating how a bunch of people might react and behave in this sort of context. And it's a curious combination of those key elements that give people this sort of experience of what it's like to run a big project. And that really, as said, was just trying to sort of give you an example of a topic like major project leadership that is very, very difficult and I would say in some sense inappropriate to try and tell people how to do it in a sort of simple recipe of success. You have to give them a sense of what it actually involves. And then a final quote really to end my bit, Stravinsky actually, isn't it? A composer who said that I've learned chiefly through my mistakes, not by my exposure to fountains of wisdom and knowledge. And do you agree? My question really on that point is, do you agree? How have you learnt the sorts of things you've learnt? Has some of it come from reading? Maybe that's clarified, maybe that has sort of clarified some of the things you sort of suspected or knew, but how much of the sort of the key skills that you use in your working lives, how much does really come from sort of, in some sense, written texts, or how much does it come from trying to make sense of actually your real experience and the costs and obvious risks associated with doing that in the real world?